Allie, just to jog our memory, because we did a lot of vocabulary, we are talking a little bit about, we used the word biomass. This is the total mass of living plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, anything that's living. David's going to sit up and kind of get his head off the desk. Thank you, my friend. We said that we're really going to be looking for the next few days at energy flow, at the transfer of food energy. We said everything comes from the sun initially. We talked about producers. Producers are plants and some algae. They produce all food. They initially convert this energy from the sun into carbohydrates, mostly sugars, via photosynthesis. The amount of energy that producers can produce, can capture, determines how many more animals the rest of that ecosystem can handle. It's why deserts have very little life, because there's not many producers in the first place. A consumer is anything that eats another plant or another consumer. We're going to be talking about trophic levels. Each step, each energy step in a food pyramid in an ecosystem is called a trophic level. And so we talked about primary producers, then primary consumers, they eat plants. Then we had secondary consumers, they eat primary consumers. We had tertiary, and then I gave you a few more, quaternary, quinary, centenary, I gave you more. We usually don't go that far because you're going to find, for reasons later on, it's difficult to have very many levels in a food pyramid because we're very inefficient. The transfer of energy from level to level to level, you'll learn, Brooklyn, only about 10% of the energy from the previous trophic level gets passed on to the next one. And typically the next trophic level are larger animals that require more energy, which means you're very rapidly ending up with fewer and fewer species or fewer and fewer numbers as you move up trophic levels. We talked about herbivores or herbivores, carnivores and omnivores. We talked about detrivores. These are consumers that get their nutrients and energy by eating dead animals and dead plant matter and animal waste. They feed at every trophic level. There's lots of them. We talked about decomposition and biodegradation, and we paused right there. Quick jogging our memory. So, a new word for you, a food web, a new 2 words, models the feeding relationship within an ecosystem. See below. Look at the picture that I gave you in your notes, Jimmy, before you turn the page. What direction do the arrows point? What do the arrows mean? Can you figure it out by looking at the arrows and by figuring out what you know about animals? What are the arrows telling me? Sarah. So if an arrow is pointing to another animal, that other animal eats the first animal. Consume, let's even use the sciencey word, consumes, because things like bacteria, do they eat? Well, not the way we think of as eating. Or detrivores, do they eat? Well, not the way we think of. Okay? Where is there a primary consumer in that picture? Sorry, a primary producer in that picture? Where is there a primary producer? Now, what would I look for? I would look for something that has arrows going from it, but no arrows going to it, because it's not eating anything else. It's getting its energy from the sun. So in this picture, what's a primary producer? Are there any? Not really. I mean, Arctic willow and purple saxifrage, they get their energy from the sun, but you can see they also need fertilizer. It's a much more complicated system than what I'm letting on. We have to simplify things quite a bit. But the key idea with the food web, Cleo, is arrows, then an arrow pointing to another animal. That other animal consumes the first species. So now you can turn the page, Jimmy. Think about all the food that you've eaten in your lifetime. Where did it all go? You don't all weigh thousands and thousands of pounds, but you've eaten thousands and thousands of pounds of food. Between 80% to 90%, and we'll probably use 90% as a rough number, of the food energy that you take in is used for the chemical reactions in your body. and it's eventually returned back to the ecosystem as heat. You may have noticed your bodies give off a lot of heat. A room full of people heats up pretty rapidly. Only about 10% of the energy that you consume goes into making you bigger, goes into helping strengthen your bones, it stays in you. About 80 to 90% goes into keeping you alive, and then it's radiated off as heat, which means it's lost to the next energy level. So very little food is actually used for growth. Julia, we're going to do some rough rounding here, but we're going to say only around 10% of the food energy from one trophic level is passed on to the next trophic level. We call this the 10% rule. And it's a rough, depending on which species and which ecosystem you're looking at, it could be higher, it could be lower. But 10% is a nice number because it's close, and it's a nice number to do math with in our head. I can find 10% of any number. I just chop off the final digit. What's 10% of 2,000? 200. What's 10% of 240? 24. What's 10% of 242? Still 24. I'm not going to be that fussy. I'll just chop off the final digit. So this gives us what are called food pyramids. A food pyramid is a model that shows the loss of energy from one trophic level to another. And we know that the amount of life that an ecosystem can support is determined by how much energy is available to pass on to the next trophic level. Where does the initial energy come from? Primary producers. What were primary producers? Also word means letter P. Yeah, mostly plants. There's others, but if you want, primary producers are plants. Lots of plants, you'll probably have lots of species. Few plants, well, you know what? This is why deserts don't have huge herds of animals. Or if you do have huge herds of animals, like in the tundra in the north, caribou, there's massive herds, or at least there were. They're dying off because humans are killing off almost everything. But there were massive herds of caribou. How did they stay alive? They had to migrate. That's your other option. You got to go where there's more plants. So here is a sample food pyramid. And we're just making up some numbers, some nice rough numbers. We have about 1,000 kilocalories of energy available from the primary producers. The 10% rule says that when you go to the next level, you'll have only about 10% of that available for the next species. 10% of 1,000 is 100. So you'll have grasshoppers, but it can only support a few grasshoppers. And then on the next level, now you've only got 10 kilocalories. And so that's why you can only support a few hedgehogs or gophers or whatever those are. And then on the next level, you only got 1 kilocalorie left, and that's why there might be only one hawk or one owl that can survive. It's why as you go up the food chain, there's fewer and fewer and fewer. You never see massive herds of lions. You see massive herds of antelope. Does that make sense? Put your pencils down, look up. So Jimmy, you saw the great circle of life there, animals eating other animals, but it gives you an idea, because that was such a limited view, but it already got very complex very quick. It's why when we're looking at ecosystems, it's difficult to make predictions as to, well, what would happen if this species went away? Or often there's unanticipated consequences when we muck around with ecosystems. We're not very good at it. What's your homework? You're going to get a homework package in just a second as well. The homework package, you're also probably going to need to refer to that mini textbook for some of the definitions and some of the words. That was also the handout I gave you last class. And then on a separate piece of paper, if you want to answer these 8 questions here, and I can go over the answers either at the end of class or else next class. I didn't include the answers to this one right here.